Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Welcome into the Tech Ed Podcast. I am Matt Kirkner, and as many of our listeners already know, for more than 20 years of my career, I spent in the world of manufacturing. I was working as a manufacturing chief executive, a chief operating officer for a while. And I've mentioned a number of times that my job was actually like that show, How It's Made. And I don't know if I'm dating myself a little bit like by saying that, but I would walk through one manufacturing operation after another, day after day, week after week, all over the United States. And I would marvel at a couple things. The first one was that I would hear about and meet with these companies that nobody had ever heard of, that I had never heard of. I would meet with these owners whose names nobody had ever heard of, and I'd see them manufacturing products that I didn't even know needed to exist until I knew that they needed to exist. And then once I knew that, it all made sense to me. But it is amazing, this subculture of manufacturing, this subculture of industrial employers that exist here in the United States. And until today, or until most recently, I didn't even realize that there was a name for that subculture, but there is. We're going to talk all about that today with a really, really fascinating guest. He is senior partner and North America managing director of McKinsey Company, an organization that I'm sure needs no introduction to our listeners. But Asutosh Padhi is our guest today. And Asutosh, first of all, welcome to Wisconsin. Second of all, welcome to Mequon in person to our Tech Ed Podcast studios. And third, and I think most important to me anyway, welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast.
Thank you, Matt. It's terrific to be with you today.
We're going to have so much fun talking about, I'm not even going to give the name away just yet, but this whole subculture that we talked about, all of these companies existing all over the United States of America, driving our economy in so many ways. You have a name for that. Why don't you tell us and tell our audience, what is that name? And then tell them a little bit about what that is.
So the name is the titanium economy. And if you think about titanium, it is durable, it's corrosion resistant, and it's all around us and we don't see it. So when we talked about manufacturing in the United States, the popular notion is that manufacturing is dead. As we took a fact-based approach, we found that that was not the case. There is a sliver of manufacturing called industrial technology. There is 6,000 of those companies around the United States. They operate in 90 different micro verticals. Think of each micro vertical as an area of specialization and focus. 80% of them are private, only 20% are public. The vast majority of them have been around for like 70 to 100 years, and 90% of them are profitable. And the reason we called it the titanium economy again is because these are not the companies where often the CEOs would make it to the front page of the leading newspaper or the leading TV channels.
Right.
And the products they make are business-to-business products. So they don't actually get the level of visibility that typically a tech company would.
Absolutely. It's so fascinating. Like I mentioned, I spent time in contract manufacturing, a lot of time in contract manufacturing. So for our listeners who may not know, it is all B2B. You're manufacturing a product for another company. And one day I might be in a medical device company. Another day I might be in a materials company. Another day I might be in some kind of an aeronautics company, automotive company, tier 3 automotive company. These companies and brands that nobody has ever heard of. But to your point, just such an important part of the American economy. Are there some examples of particular companies? You talk about these 90 verticals, Asutosh. What are some examples that our audience might not be aware of that they should be aware of?
Let me highlight two examples. The first one is a company called Corvo. Corvo is based out of North Carolina. They make a component that allows us to be able to speak as well as text on our iPhones at the same time. You often think about iPhones, but you rarely hear about Corvo. Second, I think, Matt, since we are here in Milwaukee, another company right out of Milwaukee is Brady Corporation. This is a company that really came up during World War II. They patented a system to protect wires from extreme heat and cold, and which was vital to the airplanes and ship in combat. The same technology is now used for bracelet identification for babies in hospitals. right? And you never actually make the connection. I think very few companies would actually have heard again of Brady Corporation.
Right, exactly. But everybody would be familiar with their product, or everybody would use their product. And, as I suggested in the introduction, it's like, it's all these companies that you don't even know that the product exists, or that it needs to exist, until you know that it exists. And it's like, oh my goodness, of course we need to have that. But again, a lot of companies that nobody's ever heard of. I did note that there are a number of examples from Wisconsin and Milwaukee. Is that because of the concentration of manufacturing that we have in this part of the country?
Yeah, I think it is because of the concentration of manufacturing. I think it's because of the concentration of talent. A lot of this is predicated around, as we look at the micro vertical approach, it requires companies with deep specialization and deep focus in different areas. And I think there is something to be said for the culture of innovation, which is very, very important for these types of companies.
Absolutely, that innovation culture we're going to talk about literally in just a moment. And I think as we think about the innovation side of it, but also the talent side, which we're going to go deep on, it really makes these companies sticky in a lot of ways as well, right? It's hard for them in some cases to move to other parts of the country, other parts of the globe, because they do have this center of talent, really speaking to, and we're going to go deep on that, the importance of inspiring young people into really cool careers, making sure that we continue to have a focus on CTE and STEM here in the United States, because it really is in so many ways our secret weapon. The secret weapon in terms of these titanium economy companies in many ways is innovation. So a lot of times when we think about innovation, we think about the FANG companies, we think about things that Microsoft is doing, certainly really, really important innovation, but so much of innovation in our economy, Asutosh, really comes from these titanium economy companies, from these companies, again, that maybe aren't household names, but are tremendously important in investing in the future of technology. Talk a little bit about that.
So let me give you one example, and then I'll pull back up and highlight the importance of manufacturing again. One example is Casella Waste Management Systems, right? Again, a company that probably very few people may have heard about. It's two brothers that ran a company that completely overhauled the management of waste. Now, again, they had some bumps down the road. In the 1990s, they bought like a number of different companies. But from an innovation standpoint, you would notice that you either can put stuff into a recycling bin, or you put it into garbage disposal. Right. And often, if you get it wrong, you actually have to discard the entire load of recycling. One of the things that they have done is they've come up with technology that actually allows you to be able to sort through the recycle and remove the portions of it that are garbage, so that it actually, one of the things it does is it dramatically improves the total amount of products that you can actually recycle, dramatically takes up the productivity. And if you look at it, again, just from a financial standpoint, it's a company that's doing pretty well. But think about the role and importance around, just creating a more circular economy. Right. So again, that's one practical example. But again, just on the role of manufacturing more broadly in the United States, I think one of the things that's probably not as well understood is the role that manufacturing plays in innovation today. 70% of the R&D today, a research and development budget, is actually with manufacturing companies. That's incredible. Yeah, it drives about 35% of the productivity. It drives about 60% of our exports. So these are pretty massive numbers, and very consequential from the standpoint of the United States economy.
It's absolutely phenomenal when you think about that innovation. And again, as someone that came out of the manufacturing sector, and really you innovate or die in manufacturing. I mean, that's just the life you live. And if you don't, somebody else is going to. And when you talk about some of these companies that have been around in I think you mentioned that the average was something like 70 years. Really, I mean, the technology of 70 years ago, it goes without saying, isn't the technology of today. The only way that those companies can exist in this world today is if they're continuously innovating and really taking risk. It's one thing for a large Fortune 500 company to invest a significant amount of their budget in research and development, but for a smaller company that is maybe owned by a family, that a lot of concentrated wealth and so on, even bigger risk. And here they are taking those risks in the economy. Really, really important for innovation. I'm sitting here with our book, and our audience can't tell this. A lot of times when we have guests on that have written a book, you get really good bullet points, and so you can kind of brush up on the content of the book. I actually not only read the whole book, but if you look in here, I mean, there are all kinds of things in this book that are underlined, starred, circled, and so on. Just so much information packed into what you've written here, Asutosh. And we're going to ask later in the episode where our audience can find your book. But one of the things that I was reading about is this whole idea of the great application cycle, which just fascinated me. So talk about what is the great application cycle as you define it in the book, and then maybe give us some examples of regions across the United States that are experiencing this phenomenon as we speak.
So, the grid amplification cycle really demonstrates how the titanium economy can help revitalize the US middle class and help spur more inclusive economic growth across the United States. So, let me take an example of Simpsonville in South Carolina. In the early 1980s, Michelin opened its North American headquarters. It was followed then by Bridgestone and BMW, and soon factories in the area were cranking out not just high end cars, but wide body airplanes, medical devices, and everything. And over a period of like 25 or 30 years, this has transformed the community, right? From, the median income is now $70,000, $71,000 a year. It's got really good schools. It has got a plethora of opportunities. And this hub is now known as the Golden Strip. And I think it is this whole idea about a cluster of companies, right? We often don't talk about this as much, right? We talk about the West Coast and the importance of Silicon Valley, but I think equally important are the titanium economy hubs. And every time there's a hub that's successful, it has just a very positive impact on the local economy because one, the manufacturing jobs tend to pay twice as much as service jobs, but every manufacturing job also creates 3 to 4 times the number of service jobs in that area.
Absolutely. And we talk about that all the time. I think you mentioned, in as much as we're here in metropolitan Milwaukee, if I remember from the book, something like 40 of these titanium economy companies exist just here in Milwaukee and in the metropolitan area. And I can speak from experience. You and I were talking earlier about Rockwell Automation and the great leadership of people like Blake Moret. But Rockwell Automation, a company with roots here in Milwaukee that go back to 1903. And, I ran for 10 years a Rockwell spinoff. And so I was chief executive of their metal finishing operation when they spun it off. That company, all of the other, companies making transistors, companies machining product, companies doing metal fabrication, all of those things existing here in southeastern Wisconsin because that one company decided, and certainly in that case, a large Fortune 500 as opposed to one of these smaller regional companies, but huge impact that companies like that can have on the economic viability of a region. And then, depending on what numbers you're looking at, it can be 2.5, 3 times as many jobs outside of manufacturing that are created for every person working in manufacturing. To your point, these are really good paying jobs. Average manufacturing job in Wisconsin making $65,000, $70,000 a year. And those are all people that are buying houses, they're educating their children, they're buying cars, they're eating at restaurants. I mean, and so it really, the way that money and the way that investment can reverberate throughout the economy really shows us the importance of these titanium economy companies, not just in terms of employing people, not just in terms of innovation, not just in terms of servicing other companies, but just the absolute economic viability in a region. You mentioned earlier, Asutosh, this word productivity and the importance of productivity. Obviously, being someone from manufacturing, we're always working on productivity, efficiency, yield, and so on. What is productivity and why is it so important for us to have a productive manufacturing sector here in the United States?
So, if you look at the GDP growth, which is a measure of overall economic wealth creation for everyone in the United States, GDP growth is really the multiplication of 2 factors. It is productivity growth times the size of the workforce. If you look at the United States, the size of the workforce, especially in the recent times, has actually gone down. Therefore, the way that we drive GDP growth is through productivity. We shouldn't give up on the second part, but I think the way that we can really drive it is through productivity growth. We've gone and looked at what has been the productivity trends in the United States. We looked at it 2005 through 2019. And I'll give you a couple of numbers and a bit more context around those numbers. Historically, in the post-World War II era and in the early 1980s, we were running at about 2.2 points of productivity growth every year. That number has dropped to about 1.4 points. That's not an 80 basis point drop. That's almost like a 45% drop. So if we are able to, on a go-forward basis, get our productivity back up to the historical levels, that is going to create an incremental $10 trillion in GDP for the United States alone between now and 2030. $10 trillion, right? And just to contextualize this for you, what this would mean for an average household is an increase in annual household disposable income of $15,000 per household, which is 5 times the amount that people typically receive during COVID, right? So you think about the positive impact that can have on the economy. And I think this is one of the things that that the importance of productivity as a source of wealth creation and also job creation is something that is very, very important.
There's so many things that come back to increasing that productivity. Obviously, we spend a lot of time in the world of automation and the world of advanced manufacturing. That aspect of it really, really important. The other beautiful part, and I'm sure we'll get into, is that as we use more automation, the closer that a job is to automation, typically the safer it is, the more interesting it is, the more skill it requires, therefore the higher paying it is, all kinds of benefits that kind of flow from these productivity improvements. And if you think about just the stimulus that happened during COVID as a result of all of the transfer payments and so on that happened during that era, and an economic stimulus that would be, first of all, driven by productivity, not by government spending and printing money, and secondly, an improvement that would be 5 times that amount of stimulus. That really puts into perspective in a way that I think just about anybody can wrap their brain around how important this productivity is. Some organizations, some people are really are doing this really well. Another concept you mentioned in the book, Asutosh, is this idea of productivity superstars. Tell us, what is a productivity superstar and what are those individuals and organizations doing differently than the rest of the economy?
So sure. So productivity superstars are companies that within the same industry are much more productive than the peers. Okay. And what we are now finding is that they're not just slightly more productive. They're about, in manufacturing, they tend to be 5.5 times more productive, right? You look at the cumulative impact of that over a certain number of years, and you can see how much of an impact that'll have. And titanium economy companies, there's a handful of companies that are really good, that really come out on top as far as productivity is concerned. These companies typically do 3 things really well. The first one is talent, right? Their ability to upskill talent, retain talent, and get them energized and focused around the most important priorities. Mm-hmm. The second is what you mentioned a few minutes ago, which is the importance of digitization. Mm-hmm. And not just digitizing for digitizing's sake, but changing the people, the process, and to be able to drive a different set of outcomes in the business, mm-hmm. whether that is new product development, whether that's pricing, whether it's new customer acquisition. And the third part of it is really investments in R&D, investment in research and development, other forms of intellectual property, and doing this faster and better than any other companies in the peer set. So combination of those 3 things is what makes companies a productivity superstar.
And I've always been a fan of boiling things down to their lowest common denominator. And I love the way that concept does that. We think about, everybody talks about talent. Of course, there isn't a company that we spend any time with. It's just cliche anymore about, the challenge of finding great people and retaining them, to your point, and continuing to upskill them. Obviously critical. The whole idea of digitization and who can argue about that. I actually delivered a keynote over lunch on the whole idea of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and how these vast amounts of data that we have available to us, and really bringing those concepts back to, kind of down to earth. AI and machine learning can be as complex or as simple as you want them to be. But the truth of the matter is that companies that are embracing huge seas of data, automation, digitization, automation of processes, both in terms of physical manufacturing and in terms of processing information, doing things like invoicing, accounting, and so on, really, really important. And then that whole aspect of research and development, you put those 3 things together, having great people and then having focused on digitization and productivity through digitization, and then combining that with a willingness to invest in research and development. Is it really that simple? Is that combination of 3 things that really creates that productivity?
Yeah, it is. I think obviously it takes leadership. It takes a lot of leadership. I think we often get asked, are bigger companies more productive or smaller companies? It is actually not. It's not about scale. Mm-hmm. What really matters is what is the nature of the ambition that the CEO has. What's the nature of the ambition that the management team has? We talked a little bit about in the book about the titanium economy playbook. Right. And these are companies that are very disciplined. They're focused around continuing to improve the core, mm-hmm. which is through like organic revenue growth, margin improvements. They then think about how they can upgrade the portfolio. Yep. And lastly, on a very strategic basis, they pursue mergers and acquisitions, mm-hmm. right? These are not big, grandiose mergers. These are not reckless mergers. But these are companies where they might acquire a critical technology capability, and then they are able to scale it up to the customer base and distribution channels, as an example.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of the things that really impressed me as I went through the book is these companies that are focusing on M&A as a way of growth, certainly organic growth being important as well. But a lot of them aren't doing it in the traditional sense. I mean, I spent quite a bit of time in the private equity world. I still do, right? And we use all kinds of complex debt instruments to be able to, to create leverage in business acquisitions. But so many of these they're doing it with their own cash. They're doing it with traditional bank debt and really being careful about the degree to which they lever their business models. And is that a key part of their success as well, that they're just so disciplined about how they deploy capital, how they reinvest in their business?
Discipline, capital execute, discipline on both capital as well as discipline on strategy, and are two of the hallmarks of what we saw. The discipline on capital is very much around having a strong balance sheet.
Right.
The discipline on strategy is when we talk to many of the CEOs, we often found that sometimes these companies trade over time. They did go outside the core, then they suffered and they corrected. And I think that was also quite interesting to see some of those lessons learned over the time. But certainly the discipline on the capital and the strategy, which is an intense focus on a micro vertical again, right, which is either a set of customers, a set of technologies, a set of distribution channels, and some combination of those. But the company really, once you spend years and decades, you get to be really, really good at it.
Right. Exactly. And you learn what works and you almost get a knack for what works, and you create that model and then you repeat it over and over and over again. I serve on the boards of several private companies, and we've managed to grow through really, really disciplined acquisition. And I think it is part of it is knowing who you are and who you're not, making sure that those acquisitions are core to your business model and that you're not wandering off into some, new crazy technology that you don't understand. And I think that was another flavor that I got out of the book, is that when these organizations are investing, whether it's in research and development, whether it's in organic sales growth, or whether it's in acquisitive sales growth, they're really doing it in business growth, EBITDA growth, and so on. They're really doing it with an understanding of what their core is and what they're good at, and finding ways to leverage that expertise into new markets and expand, but not do so in a way that they're getting so far out of the seas that over their skis, that they're betting the farm on the future. Maybe there were some examples of those that had to kind of find their way back to their core business, but that really seems like a key part of why these organizations have such incredible staying power, in spite of the fact that they may not have brand awareness. When we think about manufacturing, even today, I bet if you put a group of 50 people in a room and said, tell me the biggest manufacturers, they're going to talk about General Motors, they're going to talk about Tesla, they're going to talk about Ford, they're going to talk about some of those larger companies, John Deere and so on, all of which play an incredibly important role in the economy. But they have brand awareness. People know that either because they're so big you can't help but know, or their products. So many of these titanium economy companies don't have that same brand because they're a component of an end use product, or they're doing things maybe at a scale that we're not quite as familiar with. Talk though about the impact that those companies have on the broader economy, in spite of the fact that maybe they don't have the brand awareness that some of these larger companies do.
So let me, if you look at, perhaps I'll go from titanium economy to manufacturing more broadly. As we pull together the research base and the fact base, what we found is 20% or more of employment in 460 counties across the United States. 20% or more of the employment today in more than 460 counties across the United States.
Wow. Yeah. So geographically, that really kind of screams. You can look at the percentages state by state, but if you look at those geographical counties, we have regions in the country that are tremendously reliant on manufacturing as part of their economic well-being.
That's right. The thing that I think is quite relevant is if you look at exports, 60% of the exports, right, are really from manufacturing.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And so think about the importance of that.
Right.
And the last one is business R&D, right? Again, I come back to R&D again because it really drives, I think it drives our economy. And 70% of business R&D spending even today happens in manufacturing companies.
Yep. It's amazing. Yeah. So all the innovation and so much of that, has impact inside and outside of manufacturing, because obviously good innovation doesn't begin and end within a company. There's all kinds of applications. We learn from one another. We learn new applications. We learn new technologies and so on. And that really kind of creates this exponential flywheel in the overall economy. And then you think about, I think, and this isn't a political comment, but you look at like the heat maps across the country, county by county, of where people fall politically, right? And it really kind of tells a different story than looking at state by state or the entire country. I'm hearing the same kind of message on manufacturing, where we could look at a heat map regionally. We could look at it, what is the manufacturing economy in a certain region, the Midwest, for example, a certain state like Wisconsin. But then you go county by county and realize that as the closer we get to home, especially for those manufacturing centric states and regions, it really shows how much of our economic well-being and performance and way of life is driven by these titanium economies, which I always kind of knew, because again, spending so much time in manufacturing, but having it quantified by that is really fascinating. It leads you to wonder a little bit, why these types of companies don't get more press, why they don't get more attention, why they're so, I don't know if underappreciated is too strong a word, but almost underappreciated by the general population. What's your theory on that?
I would actually say underappreciated. I think that's one
Okay.
of the phrases that we actually used. It's hard to pinpoint on one factor, but I think there's several things that are going on. The first one is location. We were in a discussion with Steve Case, and one of the things he was talking about is how do you find innovation not just on the coasts, but in the interiors of America. And his point was you got to travel to actually see those people.
Right.
So one is you don't. These are I think you almost stole my line in your introduction where you said companies you didn't know about at places that you normally don't travel to, right? So the first part is actually location, and there isn't like one place. These are the titanium economy hubs are really distributed all across the country. The second part is, like, I would say what you just highlighted is just the much more of the invisible nature of the titanium economy products, right? So, for example, we all looked at a marvel of technology like the James Webb Telescope
Right.
that went into space,
Yeah.
right? About in the just around Christmas, and and if you look at the core aspects of the technology, whether it is the sensors, whether it's the types of advanced and precision manufacturing, it was the use of metallurgy and advanced composites, a lot of that technology, the core components of the technology
Sure.
development really happened with many titanium economy
Right.
companies, but you'd never make that connection between the two. And the last one is, I think, is a little bit about the ethos of these institutions, right? The CEOs, when you talk to them, they tend to be in the companies themselves. There is a what we'd call as a nose to the grindstone type
Mhm.
of ethos, right? Which is very focused around just getting the job done, getting focused on doing a great job. I think not really amplifying and talking about themselves. And I think a combination of those three things, right, I think has somehow resulted in this idea about these companies being underappreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. And you think, and all three of those are good things in some ways, right? I mean, you think about, again, having been someone who ran manufacturing companies all those years, you spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to improve process, how to improve efficiency, running Kaizen events, removing bottlenecks from process. You spend your time working with your bank and trying to inspire your teammates, dealing with that order that's going to be late, or the customer that needs a little extra help, or the quote that needs to get done by the end of the week. And I mean, that's the day in and day out grind of manufacturing. And I can see why so many of these folks maybe are more focused, perhaps in a good way, on staying completely true to their business model and making sure that they're not slipping in that way, but at the same time not necessarily getting out and telling their story and marketing their story to the greater public. I spent the last 2 weeks, Asutosh, traveling through the state of North Dakota, and the second week culminated with a one-on-one meeting with Governor Doug Burgum, who is a fascinating gentleman in his own right. And he was kind of like, he's like, why would you spend 2 weeks traveling through North Dakota? And the answer was the reason that you mentioned in the beginning to that last answer, which is you have to go out and see these things. And I said to him, I mean, they've got an incredible energy economy, agriculture economy, an incredible focus on national defense that some people may not even realize is going on up there, and then a focus on industry. And I was like, I wanted to learn about that. And the only way you do it, we call it in manufacturing, going to the Gemba, right? I have to go to the place where the action is. I have to go where things are actually taking place. And what I'm hearing from you is that we need to find more opportunities for the general populace here in the United States to get out and see these either in person or virtually, these incredible opportunities. I think there's a lot of work that education and industry can do, both of them. And we're going to talk a bit here in a little bit about the whole talent side of this thing. But are there things that both educators and these titanium economy companies can be doing to bring more awareness to the work that they're doing and their importance to the overall economy?
Yeah, I think often if you ask the question, why did we actually write this book? It was for many different reasons. But one of the reasons was to create the awareness, especially to people who are joining the workforce today, about the fact that they can actually have a long and successful career in manufacturing and do it around topics where they can make a real difference to the future of the planet. Right. And I think that was the key thing. I think we actually spent a lot of time. One of these titanium economy companies, if they are less constrained for capital, I think they're much more constrained for talent. And the interesting thing we found is that it is not actually a talent retention problem, it is a talent attraction issue, right? And therefore, it comes down to a few different things. One is skills based hiring. How do you think about continuing to hire on the basis of not 4 year college degrees, but on the basis of the skills that is needed? Second is upskilling. I know you spent a lot of time around that, but just on the job upskilling, and how do you actually teach people? For example, one of the big things that will now happen is generative AI, right? If you look at the importance, it has a real ability to be able to. It is very early days right now, and I think the initial applications are around emails and so on. But when it starts to hit the shop floor, what it'll, if in essence, do is take somebody who had 25 years of experience and get somebody with less than, let's say, 3 years of experience up to the same level of competence, because they're assisted now with technology, right? So how do we actually train people very quickly to be able to do that? And then the last thing I would say is something around continuing to work with the national credentialing, right? Which is again going to be able to help. I think there's some opportunities from the standpoint of skill sets again, right? I think so it's a combination of those ideas is where I think is where we can actually help us to have a workforce that continues to be leading edge, that allows companies to be the most productive and therefore the most competitive.
Absolutely. You think, I've been trying to wrap my brain around when we think about generative AI. What is the use case in manufacturing, and there's going to be countless opportunities and applications, but that whole idea of now, if I've got somebody that has all of this historical knowledge, they've been working in, say, industrial maintenance, they've been a machinist, they've been a metal fabrication specialist, whatever we want to call them, for 25 years, gathered all of this knowledge, this huge sea of knowledge. And one of the biggest challenges we hear from manufacturers is, where am I going to find that person? And there's a lot of answers to that question, but it sounds like part of the answer to that question is, you may not have to find that person. We may be able to find somebody with less experience, but access to, artificially intelligent generated content that we can then utilize to upskill that person, answer questions, and maybe use technology to offset the fact that maybe they don't have all that experience. I'll be using that. And it's a really, really interesting thought on how we use artificial intelligence to really kind of stem the challenge of the shortage of talent in the workforce. I know a big part of that is creating some of these industrial partnerships with specific educators. Do you have anything that comes to mind that might be interesting to our audience?
So let me highlight, let me go outside the United States for that. Let me highlight three examples that I think might be helpful. The first one is South Korea, and what South Korea has been doing around the AI manufacturing platform. There's a partnership between a state research institute and the government around sharing best practices and so on, and that's working really well. The second one is Germany's Fraunhofer Institute's 76 technical centers across the country that are focused on innovation. It's been there for a long period of time, has served Germany really well and continues to. And a relatively new one is in Singapore, right? If you look at, and say, where do you expect natural hubs of manufacturing and everything to be, Singapore would not make it to the top of the list. But this whole idea about, they call this hands-on, minds-on, hearts-on.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Saw that.
And the combination of those things, right, I think is really focused on rebranding vocational education. And today, let me give you a quick comparison. If you look at the bottom quartile of Singaporean high school, 9 out of 10 students in the bottom quartile of the Singaporean high school graduate from a technical institute and secure well-paying jobs.
I saw that in the book, and it blew me away. I mean, that's got a big star and 3 underlines on it. That is absolutely fascinating.
Right. So you look at that, and if you look at students in the bottom quartile in the United States, at risk of dropping out of high school, right, as opposed to. So there are some examples like that, I think, that we can learn from.
Absolutely. And it's just, again, as somebody that's spent all this time in manufacturing, the careers, there's so many amazing careers in manufacturing, and they're getting more and more interesting. They're getting more and more automated. You start thinking about, robotics technicians, automation technicians, electromechanical technicians, people working in and around technology. And even in my years of manufacturing, we didn't have a lot of that. And I've just kind of watched it come of age over the course of the last quarter century. So many reasons for young people to get excited about being in the titanium economy, being in manufacturing. Another thing you mentioned in the book, and it's certainly a statistic that we're well aware of. In the past 10 years, we've had 2.5 million, 2.4 million, I think, to be a little bit closer to exact industrial jobs that went unfilled in the economy. I mean, we're here near an industrial park in Mequon, Wisconsin. I can guarantee you every one of these companies is looking for really, really great people. You also mentioned, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you touched on the idea that a lot of times the challenge for these companies isn't retaining talent, it's finding that next generation of talent. What that tells me is that once people are in advanced manufacturing, they're sticking around, they're staying there, and they're finding rewarding careers. Is that true? And if so, why should a working age individual consider a job in the titanium economy?
First, that's true, right? The challenge is really talent attraction, and it comes down again to the idea of not knowing about these companies and
Hmm.
not knowing where to look.
Right.
The reason to join, there are three reasons, a young talented worker should think about joining a titanium economy company. The first one is pay, right? So if you think about relative to the service sector, these companies would pay on average twice the amount, right?
Right.
Right, 60,000 plus dollars a year of annual
Right.
income. The second one is purpose, which is the work that you're doing is actually materially important and
Right.
it actually makes a difference
Yep.
to the world, right?
Hmm.
Because the titanium economy companies, you look at the energy transition, right? You look at you look at sustainability, you look at creating more inclusivity, you think about creating better safety outcomes, right? All of that, the
Right.
core of that, I think so. Your work really makes a difference. And the third part of it is belonging, and you
Right.
actually belong to a team, you belong to a company, you're part of a community, and there is still a nice aspect of the cultural aspect of what these titanium economy companies and who they are. And often it's a combination of those three factors that actually makes it that gets these people, once they join the companies, to be able to stay there for longer periods of time.
Absolutely. I've got two kids, and one of the things that we drilled into their minds was that if we're going to help you with whatever comes after high school, you're going to work at least for a while in the world of manufacturing. I wanted them to experience that world, and what I told them was almost exactly what you just said, Asutosh. Is that number one, I want you to know the pride of getting to the end of the day and looking back over your shoulder and knowing what it's like to look at a whole bin of parts or a whole truckload of parts and say, I made that. I had a part in making that. And if you've never had that experience, it's really hard to appreciate just how incredible that can be. And that was one of my favorite things about manufacturing. The other thing I told them is that I wanted them to know the incredible and amazing people that work every day in the world of manufacturing. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that there are just so many great people, dedicated people, family people, purpose driven people, because you're right. You're not just making a part, but that part is going into something. It's going into a fighter plane. It's going into a wash machine. It's going into a medical device that is going to help a person's life become better, help protect our way of life, whatever it is. Just incredible pride that comes from working in manufacturing. And that was really important to me that my kids understood that. And I would say in a greater sense, it's important to me that the whole world understands that. And I think you characterized really well why anybody should be considering an opportunity in the titanium economy, including tech workers. I was at certainly you're familiar with FANUC, one of the largest robot manufacturers, probably the largest in the world. I was at their integrator conference in San Diego. This goes back about 2 months ago. And there was a presentation at that conference that kind of touched on the challenge of transitioning tech workers into the world of manufacturing, because there are similarities, but there are a lot of differences, both in terms of culture sometimes and in terms of the kind of work you're doing. Is that a space, as we're seeing, some of these tech companies contract a little bit and maybe look at focusing on their core and shedding some of their workforce? Are there opportunities for those individuals who may be porting out of tech and into manufacturing? Talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think manufacturing, industrial technology in particular, I think titanium economy companies specifically are a great place where many of these companies really struggled over the last 2.5, 3 years, right, and maybe even over the past decade, to be able to hire the kind of talent, the tech talent. And I think the slowdown that we've seen in terms of recruitment in the tech sector provides an opportunity right now. And we have actually seen a lot of evidence of where some of the people that have been laid off in the tech companies, for example, are getting rehired by titanium economy companies at this point in time. So I think there is a natural opportunity. I will at the same time though underscore that that in itself will likely not solve the talent issue that the titanium economy companies will have. I think it may provide part of the answer, but I think a big part of that continues to go back and say fundamentally what's the talent strategy around both attraction and reskilling.
And you go into some really good examples in the book about the importance of, and a lot of examples of companies that have engaged with their local educators and their regional educators at every level, whether it's a K-12 school district and working with middle school and high school programs to make sure that teachers, that career advisors, and so on are aware of the great career opportunities. Certainly in the technical and community colleges, one of the things that folks don't realize, and I serve on several boards related to that space as well. The companies that get the talent from your technical and community colleges aren't the people that show up at the end of the semester and say, "Hey, we're here. Would you like to?" I mean, these are people that are highly engaged for the entire process, bringing pizza, speaking at career events, serving on advisory boards. In many cases, digging into their own pockets and investing their own treasure in programs in those technical and community colleges in their high schools. And that's really how you get to the front of the line to get access to that talent. And I think you really highlight that well, very, very well in the book. Are there other strategies that senior level executives in the titanium economy space should be considering and when they're looking to find workers? We've touched on some, but are there any others we should be highlighting?
I think it is telling the stories with more purpose, with more confidence, letting the outcomes, showing the products. I think that makes a difference because one of the things is there is very little awareness of who these companies are. The other part of it is, the other part that I've not really highlighted, maybe it's worth a mention here is as we look at demographics of our workforce inside the United States, I think we're starting to get to a population that's aging, and we have this idea about retirement. And I think the question is, at some point, do we actually retire the retirement concept? Because we look at people who are like 60 plus and they leave the workforce, and they could absolutely be. Maybe these people want to play different roles, right? Maybe some people might want to be employed full time, some people might want part time, but I think there is a role for this population because they've got tremendous experience. And there's some idea of coming back and reimagining what that next phase is, as
Right.
opposed to putting a full stop and saying it's retirement. So at least those are two different ideas in there.
I love both of those ideas. And when, people every once in a while say to me, how long are you going to keep working? When are you going to retire? And my answer is 5 days before my funeral. I want to work forever because for me, it brings me, the work I do brings me a tremendous sense of purpose and a reason. Not that there aren't other reasons to get up in the morning, but I love building, I love creating. People in manufacturing, I think, sometimes gravitate toward that type of work. And I think I couldn't agree with you more. If there's one thing we need to do here in the United States, it was one thing when you live to, the average lifespan was 68 years old and you retired at 65 and you got your 3 years to sit in your rocking chair, on average. That's not the world we live in anymore. And people are living well into their 80s and 90s and beyond. That's 25 years is a long time to play golf every day. I mean, and there's so many opportunities for us to I think, keep these people engaged in the workforce, but also be flexible because you may have somebody that, for whatever reason, doesn't want to work 50 hours or 40 hours a week in manufacturing, but can still add value. The beauty, by the way, of automation is that a lot of those folks can continue to work in manufacturing much deeper into their life because the work is much safer and much less physical and more, I think, mentally fulfilling. So all kinds of exciting reasons to be involved in manufacturing, particularly in the titanium economy, Asutosh. A couple things as we're wrapping up our time together. What's been just a crazily interesting conversation for me. First of all, the book is fantastic, and I'm not just saying that because you made it all the way up to the podcast studio to chat about it. I meant what I said in the introduction. All these years of trying to define what this space was that I knew existed, but very few people did. You and your co-authors absolutely nailed it in this book. So, if our listeners, and I know they will be, are interested in getting a hold of the book, where do they find it?
I think you can find it in almost every major bookseller right now, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and many independent bookstores across the United States.
Awesome. Yeah. So just pop into wherever it is that you're getting a hold of your reading material, Titanium Economy, it'll pop up. And of course, now through the probably some titanium economy company and the magic they're working, that book can show up on your doorstep the same day or the next morning. So certainly all kinds of opportunities to get our hands on what really is a great piece of literature and just really, really invigorating and telling. I want to end our conversation, Asutosh, with the same question we ask every single guest here on the Tech Ed podcast. And that is, if you could go back in time, let's think about that 15-year-old Asutosh Padhi. Now he's, North American managing director of this huge consulting conglomerate, and obviously a tremendously influential position. But if you could go back in time and tell your 15-year-old self one thing, what would that one thing be?
That's a great question, and I would go back and reinforce one of my favorite thing in life is I think is simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
And if you watch the Kung Fu Panda, one of the things in Kung Fu Panda is it always says, "Don't try and be someone else. Try and be the best version of who you can be."
I love that.
And I think it is being the best panda that you can be. And I think just a reminder always of being able to do the things that you're uniquely good at, right? And I think as opposed to trying to be someone else, I think that's probably the thing that I would go back and tell myself.
I love that. I absolutely love that. I'm a huge advocate of that myself, and could have benefited from that advice when I was 15 years old as well. The first time somebody said be your own panda, at least on the Tech Ed podcast, and I love that. I absolutely love that concept. Be your own individual. You are certainly your own individual, speaking your mind and speaking truth in this great book, The Titanium Economy. Asutosh Padhi, it has just been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you liked this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.